First came Mossad's devastating pager attack. Then Hezbollah's walkie-talkie system was obliterated. And then an Israeli airstrike took out the Lebanon-based Shiite jihadi group's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. That was in September 2024. And in November of that year, Israel and Hezbollah signed a ceasefire agreement that seemed to signal the end of an era. Yoni Bashan is in the Middle East reporting for The Australian. Yoni, so what happened to Hezbollah back then?
Well, Hezbollah was decimated by the pager attacks and by the assassination and airstrikes of its critical leadership. And for a very long time, I think we all assumed that Hezbollah was pretty much a spent force and pretty much finished. But what we know is that over the past 16 months, or at least since it signed a ceasefire in Israel in November of 2024, that it's been very quietly regrouping. Not so quietly for Israel. Israel has been launching almost daily airstrikes on Hezbollah positions that they've tried to set up south of the Litani River, where they're not supposed to be. So not so quietly to Israel, but it has been attempting to find new smuggling routes for its weapons, for its financing, and essentially it's been attempting to re-establish itself in Lebanon, which it's done with some success, not great success, but some success. It still has a substantial stockpile of weapons that it hasn't been firing at Israel and that weren't destroyed during that initial 2 months of fighting in 2024. And those are what Israel is most worried about now as Hezbollah stands poised to join Iran in a potential war with Israel and the United States.
Donald Trump has sent to the Middle East the biggest armada we've seen in more than 2 decades in the region. He's obviously preparing for some sort of assault on Iran. Whether he carries it out or not is going to be another question. How do you think it would play out, let's say, if attacks are launched from that flotilla on Iran itself? We would expect Iran to fire back at Israel and at that flotilla. What else would happen?
Well, I think what we can expect to happen is that Iran would use its proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, and in Yemen to assist it and to bear some of the burden of retaliating, not just against Israel, but against US and allied targets in the region. That could have impacts for American bases in Qatar. It could have impacts for Americans who are stationed in Jordan. There is a very large number of American fighter jets that are currently sitting there in anticipation of what may occur. But I think most critical for Israel in particular is what the proxy forces will attempt to do on its doorstep. And Hezbollah, being at one time the world's largest non-state militia, stands to pose the greatest threat to Israel should a war of this kind kick off.
Is it possible then that we would see American forces from that armada firing on Hezbollah positions in Lebanon?
That stands to be a possibility. It also stands to be a possibility that the Americans and or other allied forces, as in previous occasions, would be mobilized to help shoot down some of the rockets that are being fired, not just by Hezbollah, but by Iran. You see, Hezbollah has been armed with substantial precision-guided missiles by Iran, and those are capable of hitting any target in Israel. Those are what Israel fears the most. It's not so much a cross-border attack, although that does remain a possibility. There are troops, there has been a recruitment effort in Lebanon, and there are Hezbollah operatives who could potentially stage a cross-border raid of the kind that we saw on October 7, 2023. But the more likely scenario would be that Hezbollah would join and support Iran, because it is at this point being directed by Iran, which it hasn't been in the past, but it is now being directed by Iranian military leaders in Lebanon to join the war against Israel.
One of the possibilities from a conflict with the United States is that there's regime change in Iran, that the present regime falls in some way or at least is significantly altered by hostilities. What do you think would happen to Hezbollah if that was the case?
I think Hezbollah would continue to exist. I mean, this is a militia group that is trying to embed itself in the Lebanese national fabric, in its politics, and it offers itself out to the Lebanese people as the only force that the country has to protect itself from any type of threat, be it US, be it Israeli, being Western imperialism of any sort. So Hezbollah is unlikely to disappear simply because the supreme leader in Iran is either deposed or assassinated or flees to Russia, in the case of what Bashar al-Assad did in Syria. It's likely to stay for a long time, but it poses a challenge because Hezbollah is unlikely to disarm on its own. It's going to have to be dismantled. And from the Israeli perspective, and certainly what security observers in this country are saying, is that the only way that will happen is if the Israelis go in and do it themselves.
I've read some reporting, Yoni, that one of the ways that Iran is funneling money to Hezbollah is through the United Arab Emirates, through Dubai, and in a really fascinating set of money exchanges, a little bit like how remittances are sent from Australia to the Pacific Islands, for example, exchange shops, moneylenders, or sort of casual network of people transmitting money. What's your understanding of how Hezbollah is actually funding itself?
So what you're referring to there is the Hawala system, which is an age-old system of money transfers that have been used in the Arab world and beyond, and it's basically a system of trust. Someone deposits money in one place and the money remitter then tells someone in another location to give the money out to a person, and then a cut is taken on either side, but the money never actually transfers from one side of the world to the other. So that's how the money is being transmitted, and money exchange systems in Dubai and in Lebanon and in other locations are being used to facilitate those transfers. But how Hezbollah is getting its money, and we have to remember that it really does need money because it's cash flow poor, is through a number of means. Firstly, the Iranian regime has funneled at least $1 billion to Iran just in the past 12 months. And what we know is that $1 billion is higher than what it's previously provided Hezbollah. We believe the estimates are around the $700 million, $800 million mark. So in the last year, it's given even more money to Hezbollah. And the way it used to do that was flying in the cash through the Beirut airport. People would arrive with suitcases full of cash, and it would just be done in a pretty low-tech way. The Lebanese armed forces have stopped that from occurring. That's been one of their successes. So Hezbollah has had to find new smuggling channels to get its arms and get its cash into the country. What they're doing is using shipping channels. They're trucking the money through Libya and then putting it on cargo vessels and then dropping it out at sea, and then someone will come and meet it out at sea and take that cargo back to shore, or they'll use one ship to carry the cargo and then swap it with another ship that meets them. And the other means by which Hezbollah raises its money is that it uses front companies. Basically, these are businessmen who are working for Hezbollah who agree to sell Iranian crude oil to, a country somewhere, or they'll sell metals and chemicals coming out of Iran to a buyer somewhere on the planet. So basically, Hezbollah companies are using Iranian resources, selling it, and then using the money to purchase weapons, pay for the reconstruction of towns in southern Lebanon that have been destroyed by the war, and to hire and pay its recruits.
Hezbollah, of course, says that what it's doing is defending Lebanon from the great Satans of Israel and the United States. The Lebanese government, though, on the other hand, has a different view, and in fact they've been cooperating with the Israeli military to try and weaken Hezbollah. So how does Lebanon fit into the picture, Yoni? Are they just being outsmarted by Iran and Hezbollah's alternative means of getting money?
Not quite. Look, the way it's been put to me is that the Lebanese armed forces are putting in a tokenistic effort to try and police Hezbollah, but they're not doing what they're tasked to do, which is disarm Hezbollah. And one of the reasons is they just can't. Hezbollah still has military control over certain parts of Lebanon. If the Lebanese armed forces want to get access to that territory, they have to seek permission from Hezbollah. And Hezbollah can wish to grant it, or they can deny it. So there's no seizing weapons if you can't get access to certain bits of terrain. Occasionally, we will see releases being made public about the Lebanese armed forces procuring some weapons from Hezbollah because a raid's occurred. But what I'm being told is that these are staged arrangements in which Hezbollah will willingly or voluntarily agree to give up some weapons. The Lebanese armed forces will take them, and Hezbollah will do this strategically so its greater stockpile of weapons won't be touched, and the Lebanese armed forces will appear as though they're actually doing a really good job, but they're not. And when I ask people why that might be the case, the answer commonly given to me is a demographic one. It's because the Lebanese armed forces are up to 60% Shiite Muslim, and Hezbollah is a Shiite Muslim entity. And what that means in practice is that many of the people who occupy the Lebanese armed forces have extended family networks that go into Hezbollah. They live in the same villages and communities as Hezbollah fighters. It's a very awkward thing to try and manage. Lebanon has very distinct memories of 2 civil wars. They don't want to become involved in a third one. And that's ultimately where this is heading. If the Lebanese armed forces crack down too hard on Hezbollah, the concern is that it might erupt with another great fracture in its society. And Lebanon desperately wants to try and avoid that.
The Mossad strikes on Hezbollah's pager network and then its walkie-talkies was so effective and effective as a piece of PR as well as a strategic operation. It had taken decades for Mossad to insert itself into Hezbollah's supply chain to make sure that they were supplying the pagers and the walkie-talkies that subsequently they were able to detonate. Was it then a mistake, and did Israel move too quickly in signing that ceasefire in late 2024?
I would suggest the answer is no, and I would suggest that the threat posed by Hezbollah in 2024 was so great and so pressing that the need to decapitate its leadership and to quite literally hobble its membership was acute. Israel took that opportunity. If it hadn't have done that, it was facing cross-border raids that would have been reminiscent of what occurred on October 7. The pressing issue that Israel faced at the time was that practically its entire north had been evacuated and hundreds of thousands of residents had to be relocated to the south of the country or to the centre. They were being subsidised to live in hotels. They were being subsidised to purchase food. This was not a sustainable situation. You effectively had a country in Israel that wouldn't and couldn't allow its residents to move back to their communities and to have functioning infrastructure and essentially a functioning society because the threat of missiles being fired on a daily basis was just too high. That's not a situation any country in the world would be prepared to put up with. And what the people in Israel demanded, and certainly what the northern communities demanded, was a full-scale routing of Hezbollah in that region so they could return to their homes. What we've seen since then has been the decimation of Hezbollah. It's no longer the force that it was. However, the rebuilding of those communities in the north hasn't happened at speed. Probably a quarter of some of the biggest towns in the north of Israel have returned. Most of the young people who are living there aren't in a rush to go back. They've relocated to cool, funky cities like Tel Aviv, and they like it there. So the attacks that decimated Hezbollah were by all means necessary from an Israeli military and leadership perspective. Whether they solve the problems of what to do with the north of Israel is a different story.
You've been to Israel on a lot of reporting trips since October 7, 2023, and of course you're now our North Asia correspondent, Yoni, so this is very North Asia, I think, for you. You've come back there to report on this build-up of tensions now. What's the mood in Israel compared to those earlier trips that you've been on, which have ranged from the aftermath of October 7 to, hot war between Iran and Israel?
Yeah, so on previous occasions, I've arrived, often with my colleague Liam Mendez, and we've walked into what's essentially been something very hot. Missile strikes have already occurred, or in the case of October 7, the monumental attack itself had occurred. So we were walking in at a time when Israelis were experiencing anger, shock, disbelief, rage, all the full spectrum of emotions. I've also been back on the anniversary of October 7, 2 anniversaries of October 7, and the atmosphere on those occasions is one of just immense, extraordinary sadness. This time, it's a little bit different. We haven't had an attack yet. Israelis have mostly become inured to life under the threat of missile fire from Iran or from Hezbollah or Hamas or from the Houthis in Yemen. I would say that since I've arrived here, the atmosphere is one of business as usual. People aren't really talking about it. I've been sitting in cafes, eavesdropping on people between their bowls of hummus and pita bread. They're not talking about this. They're talking about, the Israeli version of "So You Think You Can Dance" or whatever. And when I ask people, I've been talking to people who've been arriving in the country. When I was standing in the airport, or standing next to 2 young women, and I said, "Is now the right time for you guys to come here? I understand things are going to get pretty hot." And they said, "Well, that's just the way it is around here, and we're prepared to put up with it." So I wouldn't say the atmosphere or the idea in people's head is one of lackadaisicalness, but it seems to be that there's a contract or an acceptance that if you come to Israel, you may have to run to a bomb shelter. And I think the people who are living here know that, and the people who are coming here seem to be aware of it. So everyone's putting up with it.
You mentioned before that Israelis are much more used to this reality of Hezbollah's rearming than the rest of the world, which probably could be excused for not having paid too much attention to that in the past couple of years. But do you think there's a sense of disappointment that there was an opportunity, it seemed close at hand, that Hezbollah might be eliminated altogether, but that has very much not been the case?
I don't sense a feeling of disappointment. I'm sure you will find some people who certainly feel that way, but I think most people would realise the reality of the task that Israel was facing at the time. It took out Hezbollah's leadership and quite a large cohort of its membership at a time when it was still fighting a war in Gaza, when it was still trying to bring home hostages, when it was still being fired upon by the Iranians and by the Houthis in Yemen, while it was trying to bed down the West Bank, and while it was enduring, daily cyber attacks. What it was able to achieve in relation to Hezbollah was simply extraordinary, and was something unlike the world had ever seen. I think what it did in the short term was put an end to the persistent and real threat of rocket fire from Hezbollah. I think it's inevitable that Hezbollah would have tried to rearm itself. It hasn't done that to a standard where it today looks like the force it was. It's done it to a standard where it does pose a threat, but the risk is not as high as what it would have been if Israel had done nothing in relation to Hezbollah, because it looks nothing like the Hezbollah that was on October 6, 2023.
Yoni Bashan, thank you very much for joining us, and stay safe.
Thank you.